Three ruthless killers made a mistake. They rode into the dusty streets of Copper Ridge, Nevada, in the autumn of 1864, and saw just another broken-down old drifter. They saw trembling hands and clouded eyes. They saw a life at its end. They didn't see the ghost sleeping inside. They didn't see the most feared gunslinger the West had ever known. And they were about to corner him, unaware that their mistake wouldn't just cost them their pride. It would cost them everything. The wooden chair on the general store porch creaked like old bones under Ezra Malone's weight. Dust, fine as powdered cinnamon, swirled around his worn-out boots. The heat was a physical thing. A heavy blanket laid over the small town. His hands, the left one in particular, shook as he lifted a dented tin cup to his lips. The coffee was bitter, weak, and cold, but it was all he had. It did nothing to wash away the taste of another night spent staring into the darkness, haunted by ghosts of his own making. Children, their faces bright with life, ran past him without a second look. Their laughter bounced off the sun-bleached wooden storefronts. To them, he was invisible. Part of the scenery. A forgotten piece of furniture left to rot in the sun. His faded coat, once a deep cavalry blue, now the color of a tired sky, hung loose on a frame that had seen too many winters and not enough meals. The mirror inside Widow Henderson's store, the one he tried to avoid, showed him a stranger's face. Hollow cheeks, a tangled gray beard, and eyes that had lost their fire. Clouded, tired, blue eyes. But those same people, the ones who hurried past with their noses in the air, didn't know the truth. They couldn't see what was hidden. Those shaking fingers, the ones that could barely hold a coffee cup, had once been as steady as granite. That weak voice, the one that now whispered, "Much obliged for the scraps," had once thundered through smoky saloons, making grown men drop their cards and beg for mercy. Because deep inside his coat, wrapped in a piece of oiled cloth that felt like a second skin, lay a Colt Navy revolver. Its ivory grip was smooth from 1,000 draws, and it hadn't seen the light of day in 10 long years. But it was there, waiting. A group of townspeople, the mayor and his wife among them, scurried past. Their whispers stopped the moment they noticed him. But he caught the words anyway, sharp and cruel like shards of glass. "Worthless old fool. Why doesn't the sheriff run him out of town? He's bad for business." Their faces wore a familiar mask of disgust, mixed with a sour kind of pity. The look you give a sick animal you're about to put out of its misery. Ezra just pulled the brim of his hat down lower, hiding his face, and stared at the endless dust of the main street. Memories, unwelcome and sharp, flickered behind his tired eyes. He saw saloons thick with cigar smoke and the smell of cheap whiskey. He felt the solid weight of a U.S. Marshal's badge on his chest. He heard the jingle of his spurs on wooden floorboards, a sound that could silence a room in a single heartbeat. But those days felt like a story someone else had lived. A dream he'd woken from a long, long time ago. The sun climbed higher, baking the desert town until the very air shimmered. Horses stamped and swished their tails at the buzzing flies. The rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer was the town's steady heartbeat. Ezra closed his eyes, trying to remember what it felt like to matter, to have his name spoken with respect, not contempt. The memories came in flashes: a gunfight in Abilene, a blizzard in the Rockies, the face of a woman he'd once loved, a reputation that traveled faster than any telegraph wire, a time when the name Ezra, the Ghost, Malone, meant something more than just another drifter waiting to die. A shadow fell across his face, a sudden eclipse blocking the harsh sun. He opened his eyes. 3 men on horseback had stopped directly in front of the store. Their leader, a man who sat his horse like he was born in the saddle, had a cruel smile playing on his lips. His 2 companions flanked him like a pair of loyal wolves, their hands resting casually, confidently, on their gun belts. "Well now," the leader's voice cut through the afternoon quiet, dripping with the kind of arrogance that comes from never having lost a fight. "What in the hell have we got here?" The 3 riders dismounted, their boots hitting the wooden porch with the solid thud of men who believed they owned any ground they stood on. Their leader was maybe 20 years younger than Ezra, with dark, empty eyes and hair as black as a raven's wing. His clothes were too clean for this dusty town. His guns hung low and tied down, the mark of a professional killer. "Name's Caleb Thorpe," he announced, spitting the words like they were a challenge. "Maybe you've heard of me." Ezra had. Oh, he'd heard the name. Whispered in saloons from Carson City to Santa Fe. Caleb Thorpe. A gun for hire. A debt collector for rich men who like to keep their hands clean. They said he'd killed 12 men in so-called fair fights, and at least twice that many who never even saw him draw. He was a vulture. A man who left behind a trail of ruined families and unmarked graves. The shorter man beside him, one with a pinched, weasel-like face, spat a stream of brown tobacco juice that landed inches from Ezra's worn boot. "Boss asked you a question, old-timer," the weasel, a man they called Rico, snarled. "It's rude not to answer." Ezra's grip tightened on his tin cup, the metal groaning under the pressure. But he kept his voice low, level. "Just trying to enjoy the morning in peace." "Peace?" Thorpe let out a laugh that sounded like rocks grinding together. "That's rich. Coming from a man who looks like he crawled out of his own grave. You're bad for business, old man. You make the paying customers nervous, seeing trash like you cluttering up the place." The third man, a giant built like a brick outhouse with fists the size of smoked hams, cracked his knuckles. The sound was like twigs snapping, sharp and loud in the tense silence. "Want me to encourage him to move along, boss?" Sledge, they called him, a fitting name for a man who used his fists like hammers. Across the street, a small boy with sandy blonde hair pressed his face against the window of the barber shop. He was watching, his eyes wide and unblinking. There was something in the boy's gaze that tightened Ezra's chest. A flicker of defiance. A small, desperate hope. His little hands were clenched into fists, as if he wanted to charge across the street and help, but was held back by a fear he didn't quite understand. Thorpe followed Ezra's gaze and his cruel smile widened. "Cute kid," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing purr. "Be a real shame if something were to happen to him. A real shame if he had to see something unpleasant, all because some old fool didn't know when to show proper respect." The threat was no longer implied. It hung in the hot, still air, heavy and poisonous as a rattlesnake coiled to strike. And deep inside Ezra Malone, in a place he thought had died years ago, something stirred. It wasn't fear. It was fire. A cold, familiar rage he hadn't felt in a decade. It was the same feeling that had made him pin on a star all those years ago. The same burning drive that had compelled him to stand between decent folk and the wolves who preyed on them. "Leave the boy out of this," Ezra said. His voice was quiet, but it had an edge of cold steel that hadn't been there a moment before. "Your business is with me." "Business?" Rico sneered, kicking a cloud of dust toward Ezra's chair. "Old man, you ain't got enough fight left in you to have business with a field mouse. Look at you, shaking like a leaf in a windstorm. When was the last time you had a decent meal?" Thorpe stepped closer, his silver-tipped boots making sharp, rhythmic sounds on the wooden planks. Each step was a hammer blow, driving the tension higher. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, leaning in so Ezra could smell the whiskey on his breath. "You are going to take your sorry, pathetic hide off this porch, out of this town, and out of my sight. And if I ever see your face on this street again, my boys and I are going to have a little fun with you. The kind of fun that ends with a shallow grave and no questions asked." The tin cup rattled against Ezra's knee, his left hand shaking worse than ever. It was a pathetic sight, a broken old man on the edge of ruin. But something else was happening. Something no one could see. His right hand, hidden from view, the one that never trembled, was slowly, deliberately, moving toward the opening of his coat pocket, toward the oiled cloth, toward the cold, patient steel of the Colt Navy. But it wasn't Thorpe who noticed the slight movement. It was Rico. The weasel-faced man saw the shift in Ezra's posture, the subtle change in his eyes. And a flicker of something, a ghost of a memory, crossed his face. He'd seen that look before, in a saloon in Dodge City, on the face of a man just before he killed 3 brothers in the blink of an eye. He opened his mouth to warn Thorpe, a sudden sweat beading on his upper lip. "Boss, wait!" But it was too late. Rico's boot lashed out like a striking snake. It connected with the tin cup with a sound like a gunshot, sending it spinning through the air. The cup crashed against a wooden post with a jarring clang, and the dark, bitter coffee splashed all over the front of Ezra's only coat. The ugly brown stain spread across the faded blue fabric like a fresh bloodstain. Ezra just stared down at his ruined coat, watching the brown liquid drip from the sleeves onto the dusty planks. His shoulders slumped, as if this final petty humiliation was the last straw, the one thing that could finally break what little spirit he had left. The townspeople watched from their windows and doorways. Some shook their heads in pity. Others turned away, unable to watch the cruel spectacle. But behind Ezra's clouded eyes, a single dangerous spark ignited. His right hand, the steady one, didn't stop. It continued its slow, deliberate journey, his fingers brushing against the cool, oiled cloth. "Look at that!" Thorpe roared with laughter, slapping his thigh as if he'd just heard the funniest joke in the whole Nevada territory. "The old-timer thinks he's gonna make a play. What you got in there, Grandpa? A rusty old pepper box that hasn't been fired since the Mexican War?" Sledge cracked his massive knuckles again, each pop a punctuation mark to Thorpe's mockery. "Maybe we should check, boss," the big man rumbled. "Can't be too careful with these old coots. Sometimes they get desperate ideas." But Rico wasn't laughing. He was staring at Ezra's face, at the set of his jaw, the sudden stillness in his body. The memory was clearer now. It wasn't Dodge City. It was a wanted poster, a poster he'd seen years ago, offering a reward so high it was mythical. For a man they called a ghost, a man who had supposedly died in a fire in Deadwood 2 decades ago. The name on the poster was Malone. Across the street, the small boy, Danny McKenna, was no longer just watching. His face was a mask of desperate hope, his eyes silently pleading with the old man to do something, to be the hero from the stories his father told him. The boy reminded Ezra of someone else. Another child, another town, a lifetime ago. A promise he'd made and a promise he'd broken. A memory that was the source of all his pain, the reason he'd buried the ghost and let Ezra Malone wither away. "You got 10 seconds to show us what's in that pocket," Rico snarled, trying to sound tough, but his voice had a new tremor in it. His own hand dropped to rest on the handle of his gun. "And it better not be anything that'll make us nervous." Ezra's fingers finally closed around the smooth, familiar ivory grip of his Colt. The weapon felt like a part of him, an old friend welcomed home after a long and lonely separation. In that single moment of contact, the arthritis that had plagued him for years seemed to vanish. The pain in his joints disappeared, replaced by the deep, instinctual muscle memory of 3 decades of life and death. The wind picked up, swirling little dust devils around their boots. The wooden signs above the storefronts creaked on their chains. Far off, a church bell began to chime the hour, its heavy bronze voice rolling across the desert. A prayer, or a warning. "Time's up, old man," Thorpe said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. He was done playing games. He started to reach for his own gun. "Let's see what you're hiding." But before his hand could move an inch, a new voice cut through the afternoon heat, sharp and clear and full of cold authority. "Thorpe, you yellow-bellied snake!" Everyone spun around. Striding down the middle of the street was a man who wore authority like a well-tailored suit. Sheriff Owen McKenna. He was 55, maybe older, with steel-gray hair and a mustache trimmed with military precision. The silver star on his chest caught the afternoon sun, flashing like a heliograph. His right hand rested easily on the butt of his Colt Peacemaker. But it was his eyes that stopped Thorpe cold. They were pale gray, the color of a winter sky, and they held the weary certainty of a man who had seen too much death and wasn't afraid to create a little more if the situation required it. "Well, well," Thorpe drawled, though some of the swagger had gone out of his voice. He tried to recover, to regain control. "If it ain't Sheriff McKenna. Come to spoil our fun?" McKenna stopped about 20 paces away, giving himself plenty of room to draw if things went south. "This what you call fun these days, Caleb? Picking on old folks? Must be getting soft in your old age." Rico and Sledge shifted their weight, their hands hovering nervously near their guns. They were hired killers, but even they knew better than to draw on a lawman with McKenna's reputation without a very good reason. Ezra remained perfectly still, a statue on the porch steps. His right hand was still buried in his coat, a secret waiting to be told. The sour smell of spilled coffee was already attracting flies in the desert heat. He felt like a spectator at his own execution. "Funny thing about timing," McKenna continued, his voice taking on the slow, deliberate tone of a man laying a trap. "Just got a telegram from Carson City. Seems there's a reward posted for 3 men. Men who robbed and murdered the Patterson family up north last month. Left a woman and her 2 little girls dead in their own kitchen." The color drained from Rico's weasel face. He looked like he'd seen a real ghost. Sledge took a half step back towards the horses, his massive frame suddenly looking less intimidating and more like a cornered bear looking for an escape route. But Thorpe just held his ground and smiled, though the smile didn't reach his cold, dead eyes. "That's a serious accusation, Sheriff. Hope you got proof to back up that kind of talk." "Witnesses," McKenna said, his gaze never leaving Thorpe's. "They said the killers were 3 men riding together. One of them had a scar, a nasty one, running from his left ear all the way down to his jawline. Funny coincidence, don't you think?" Thorpe's hand instinctively flew to the jagged white line that marked his face, a souvenir from a knife fight in Sacramento. His smile faltered. For just a heartbeat, pure animal panic flashed in his eyes before he got it back under control. But Ezra saw it, and so did the sheriff. And then, from across the street came a sound that made every man there freeze. The creak of a door, the soft patter of small footsteps on wooden planks. Danny McKenna, the sheriff's 10-year-old son, had pushed his way out of the general store. And with the fearless, beautiful, terrible innocence that only children possess, he started walking directly into the middle of the standoff. "Danny, no!" A woman's voice, his mother's, cried out from inside the store. But the boy didn't stop. His small chin was set with a stubborn courage that was the spitting image of his father's. "Pa!" the child called out, his high, clear voice cutting through the tension. "You don't have to face them alone." The distraction lasted only a second, but in the deadly calculus of a gunfight, a second is an eternity. An eternity Thorpe used to his advantage. His hand, a blur of motion, swept down toward his holster. But he wasn't drawing on Sheriff McKenna. He was drawing on the boy. Time shattered. The world didn't just slow down. It fractured into 1,000 tiny, crystal-clear moments. Ezra saw the boy's innocent face, frozen in a mask of courage and fear. He saw Sheriff McKenna's mouth open in a silent scream, his own hand struggling to clear his holster, but he was 20 feet away, a lifetime too far to save his son. He saw Thorpe's lips peel back in a triumphant snarl, the black bore of his pistol swinging towards the small, defenseless child in the middle of the street. And in that frozen moment, the ghost woke up. 30 years of buried instinct, of lightning-fast decisions made in the space between heartbeats, exploded to life. Ezra's body moved before his mind could even register the thought. His right hand, no longer slow and deliberate, whipped out of his coat pocket with the speed of a striking viper. The ivory-handled Colt Navy was suddenly in his palm, not as a separate object, but as a living extension of his will. The tremor in his left hand was gone. The clouds in his eyes burned away, replaced by a blue fire that had once made entire towns go quiet. 3 shots. They weren't separate sounds. They were a single, terrifying rip in the fabric of the afternoon, faster than a man could blink, faster than he could draw a breath. The first bullet, a piece of flying lead moving with impossible precision, struck Thorpe's gun hand. It didn't just hit it, it shattered it. The pistol flew from his grasp, spinning through the air like a child's broken toy, and blood sprayed across the wooden planks of the porch. A high-pitched, inhuman scream tore from Thorpe's throat as he staggered back, clutching his mangled fingers. The second shot, a heartbeat after the first, was even more unbelievable. It struck the buckle of Rico's gun belt, shattering the metal and severing the leather. The entire rig, holster and all, clattered to the ground, leaving the weasel-faced killer standing there, unarmed, his mouth hanging open in slack-jawed disbelief. The third bullet, so fast it seemed to follow the second without a pause, found Sledge. The big man had been reaching for a whiskey bottle tucked into his belt. The bullet struck the glass, and the bottle exploded in a shower of amber liquid and glittering shards, soaking the front of his pants. He howled in shock, stumbling backward as if he'd been punched by an invisible fist. "Sweet Jesus," Sheriff McKenna whispered. His own gun was half drawn, forgotten in his hand. "I ain't never seen shooting like that, not in all my born days." And then Ezra stood up. He rose from the creaking chair not like an old man, but like a king rising from a throne. His legs, which had trembled and failed him for years, were now as steady as mountain stone. The shaking in his left hand had vanished as if it had never existed. He was taller, straighter, and the tired, broken man from moments ago was gone. In his place stood a legend. The townspeople, who had been hiding behind curtains and in doorways, now pressed forward, their faces a mixture of raw shock and breathless wonder. Children peeked out from behind their mothers' skirts, their eyes wide, sensing they were witnessing something that would be told and retold for 100 years. In the middle of the street, little Danny McKenna stood frozen, his face a perfect picture of awe. His mother rushed out from the store, her face pale with terror and relief, and swept him into her arms, burying his face in her dress. Thorpe swayed on his feet, his face the color of old parchment. Blood seeped between the fingers of the hand clutching his ruined one. Sweat beaded on his forehead. He stared at the old man, his eyes wild with pain and disbelief. That's impossible," Rico stammered, his voice cracking. "It can't be. Ezra Malone. The ghost. He died. He died 20 years ago in a fire in Deadwood. Everybody knows that story." Ezra allowed himself a small, cold smile. It held no warmth, only the chilling promise of a winter storm. "Son," he said, his voice no longer a weak whisper, but a low, resonant rumble that carried across the street. "You shouldn't believe everything you hear in saloons." He took a step forward, the ivory-handled Colt still held loosely in his steady right hand. "The ghost has been sleeping, not dead." He let the words hang in the air for a long moment, his blazing eyes fixed on the three terrified men. "And you fools. You just woke him up." The late afternoon sun cast long, dramatic shadows across the dusty street, making Ezra's figure seem impossibly large, a giant from an old tale come to life. His stained coat fluttered in the desert breeze, and the Colt navy in his hand caught the golden light, gleaming like polished silver. It was more than a gun. It was a scepter, a symbol of judgment. Rico and Sledge began to backpedal towards their horses, their movements clumsy with fear. They looked at Ezra not as a man, but as an apparition, a specter of vengeance risen from the grave. Thorpe tried to follow, but his legs were weak from shock and blood loss, and he stumbled, nearly falling to his knees. "Now then," Ezra said, and his voice was the sound of distant thunder, a promise of the storm to come. "We need to have ourselves a little talk, about manners, and about leaving innocent children alone." The silence that followed was absolute. It was tight and stretched, like a bowstring pulled to its breaking point. Every man, woman, and child in Copper Ridge held their breath, waiting. The legend was real. The ghost was walking their streets, and no one knew what he would do next. Sheriff McKenna, his face a mask of stunned respect, slowly, deliberately, holstered his own weapon. He walked over to his wife and son, placing a protective hand on Danny's shoulder, but his eyes never left Ezra. It was the look one fighting man gives to another, an acknowledgement of superior skill and unbreakable will. "You boys have two choices," Ezra announced, his voice slicing through the silence. He never took his eyes off Thorpe. "You can get on your horses, ride out of Copper Ridge, and you never ever come back. Or," he paused, letting the word hang in the air, "you can stay and try your luck again. But I feel I should warn you. I'm feeling a whole lot better than I did 10 minutes ago." Thorpe's face was a twisted canvas of pain and pure, unadulterated rage. Blood dripped steadily from his shattered hand, forming a small, dark puddle in the dust at his feet. "This ain't over, old man," he spat, his voice thick with hate. "Nobody. Nobody makes Caleb Thorpe look like a fool and lives to tell about it." "Funny thing about that," Ezra replied. He gave the Colt a casual, almost lazy spin around his trigger finger before sliding it back into his coat pocket. The movement was as smooth as flowing water and twice as dangerous. "I've been dying by inches for the last 10 years, Thorpe. The idea of you killing me is about as frightening as a paper bag full of wind." Martha McKenna, the sheriff's wife, stepped forward, her arms still wrapped tightly around her son. Tears streamed down her cheeks, cutting clean paths through the dust on her face, but her voice was strong. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Mr. Malone. Danny, he's all we have left. We lost our other children to the fever 2 summers back." Those words struck Ezra with the force of a physical blow. Suddenly it all made sense. The fierce, desperate look in the sheriff's eyes. The way the boy's mother clung to him as if he were made of spun glass. They had already endured the worst kind of loss a parent can know. They had nothing more to give. "Ma'am," Ezra said, his voice softening, the hard edges melting away. "Sometimes we don't choose to be heroes. Sometimes the job chooses us." Widow Henderson, the proprietor of the general store, a woman who hadn't given Ezra the time of day for 6 months, stepped out onto her porch. Her gray hair shone in the afternoon light. "Ezra Malone," she called out, her voice clear and strong. "You saved that boy's life. As far as I'm concerned, you've got a job waiting for you at my store, for as long as you want it." The offer hung in the air. A job, a place, a reason to stay. It was a lifeline thrown to a man who had forgotten he was drowning. Ezra looked around, at the faces of the townspeople staring at him. The pity was gone. The disgust was gone. In its place was something he hadn't seen directed at him in 20 years. Respect. Awe. Gratitude. Rico, seeing his chance, scrambled to help the bleeding Thorpe onto his horse. Sledge was already mounted, his big hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the reins. He kept glancing over his shoulder, as if he expected a bullet in the back at any second. "Remember what I told you, boys," Ezra called out, his voice carrying easily to the retreating figures. "If I ever hear of you bothering innocent folks again, especially children, I won't send a telegram. I'll come looking for you myself, and next time, I might not be feeling nearly so generous." The 3 outlaws didn't need to be told twice. They spurred their horses into a frantic gallop, fleeing town as if the devil himself were on their heels, leaving nothing behind but a cloud of dust and the stark, chilling memory of how quickly a forgotten legend could rise from the grave. As they vanished into the desert haze, the people of Copper Ridge began to emerge from their homes and shops, drawn toward the man on the porch. The spell was broken, and little Danny McKenna, a boy who had just looked death in the eye, broke free from his mother's embrace. He walked right up to the most dangerous man he would ever meet, his young face filled with a fearless curiosity that only a child could possess. "Are you really him?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Are you really the ghost?" Ezra looked down at the boy, at the hero worship shining in his eyes, and for the first time, he didn't feel the weight of his past as a burden, but as a foundation. He knelt, bringing himself down to the boy's level. "I was, once upon a time," he said gently. "But ghosts are supposed to stay buried, son. They belong to the past." He placed a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. Maybe it's time for Ezra Malone to try living again, instead of just surviving. The sun was beginning to dip behind the distant mountains, painting the desert sky in breathtaking shades of fire and purple. And for the first time in 20 long, lonely years, Ezra Malone felt something he thought he had lost forever: hope. The dying sun bled across the wooden buildings of Copper Ridge, turning dust to gold. As the last of Thorpe's dust settled, Sheriff McKenna walked toward Ezra, his boots crunching in the quiet street. The tension had broken like a fever, replaced by a strange, peaceful awe. "Mr. Malone," the sheriff said, his voice raspy with emotion. He extended a weathered, calloused hand. "I reckon I owe you a debt I can never repay. That boy, he's my whole world." Ezra took the offered hand. It was warm and strong, a solid human connection. For so long people had avoided touching him, as if his misery were contagious. "No debt, Sheriff," Ezra said, his voice quiet. "I'm just glad my old hands remembered what to do when it mattered most." Young Danny, squirming free from his mother's embrace, ran to his father's side, his face aglow. "Pa! Did you see him? Did you see how fast he was? It was like lightning. 3 times in a row!" McKenna scooped his son into a fierce hug, holding him tight against his chest. "I saw it, son. I saw it. But don't you ever do something so foolish again. What you did was brave, but it was a fool's bravery." Danny just grinned, peering over his father's shoulder at Ezra. "Are you really the ghost from the stories? The one they say could shoot the wings off a fly from 100 yards? The question settled in the twilight air. Ezra felt the immense weight of his past, of the name he had tried to bury for 2 decades. All those years of running, of hiding in plain sight, of pretending to be a broken shadow of a man. He thought of the young, arrogant gunfighter he had once been, proud of his deadly reputation. Then he looked at this family, at the fierce love between father and son, the quiet strength of the mother, and something deep inside his chest, something hard and frozen, began to thaw. "I was that man once," Ezra admitted, his voice slow and deliberate. "But ghosts belong in the ground, son. They're all about endings." He looked directly into Danny's eyes. Maybe it's time for plain old Ezra to think about a new beginning. Martha McKenna came to stand beside her husband, her hand resting on his arm. The tears had stopped, but her eyes were still shining. "Mr. Malone," she began, her voice shaking slightly, "I don't have the words to thank you. When the fever took our girls, a part of us died with them. Danny is all the light we have left." Her words explained everything. The desperation, the raw terror. They were a family clinging to their last hope, and Thorpe had tried to snuff it out. It was a pain Ezra understood all too well. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was as gentle as a desert breeze at dawn. "Sometimes we don't get to choose our battles. They choose us. All we can do is try our best not to let folks down when we're called." As true darkness began to settle, a remarkable thing happened. The people of Copper Ridge, the same people who had scorned him that very morning, began to approach. Not with fear, but with reverence. Old Pete, the blacksmith, a man with arms as thick as tree limbs, came over and clapped him solidly on the shoulder. Mrs. Henderson bustled out of her store and pressed a fresh, steaming cup of coffee into his hands. The good stuff, not the bitter dregs she usually gave him. The children, who had once run from the strange, trembling old man, now gathered around him, their faces upturned, their eyes begging for a story. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Ezra Malone wasn't an outsider. He wasn't a ghost or a drifter. He was one of them. He belonged. 3 weeks later, the morning sun found Ezra sitting on the exact same porch steps. But everything was different. The cup in his hand was steady. The coffee was hot and strong. His coat was clean, mended by Mrs. Henderson herself. The tremor in his left hand was still there, a quiet reminder of his age. But it was no longer the defining feature of his existence. He had remembered who he was beneath the years of dust and regret, and that memory had made him whole again. Sheriff McKenna strolled over from his office, a yellow slip of paper, a telegram, fluttering in his hand. A satisfied grin was plastered across his face. "Thought you might want to see this," he said, settling down on the step next to Ezra, as if they'd been friends for a lifetime. "Got word from the marshal up in Elko. Seems our 3 troublemakers decided to try their luck at the First National Bank yesterday." Ezra took a slow sip of his coffee. "And how did that work out for them?" he asked, a hint of a smile touching his own lips. "Rico and that big fella, Sledge," McKenna reported with grim satisfaction. "They won't be bothering anyone ever again. As for Thorpe, he's still breathing, but just barely. Seems that busted trigger finger you gave him made him a little slower than molasses in winter. Bank guard put 2 bullets in his chest before he could even clear leather." Justice. It was a clean, simple thing sometimes. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the life of their small town unfold. Wagons rumbled past. Children played tag in the street. It was the beautiful, ordinary music of a place where people felt safe. Young Danny came around the corner, his schoolbooks tucked under his arm. He had a serious, thoughtful look on his freckled face. He walked right up to Ezra, standing before him with the solemn dignity of a boy with a very important question. "Mr. Malone," he began carefully, "I've been thinking about what you said, about ghosts needing to stay buried." "Have you now?" Ezra said, setting his cup down. "And what did you figure out?" "Well," Danny said, choosing his words like a prospector searching for gold, "I think maybe some ghosts aren't supposed to stay buried forever. I think maybe some of them are supposed to come back when good people are in trouble. Like guardians." Ezra looked at the boy's earnest face and saw the unshakable certainty of youth, a time when the world was drawn in clear lines of good and evil. "You might be onto something there, son," he said. "The trick is knowing when to be the ghost and when to be the man." "How do you tell the difference?" Danny asked. The old gunslinger looked out at the busy street. He saw Sheriff McKenna on the jailhouse steps, reading the town newspaper. He saw Mrs. Henderson sweeping the dust from her porch. He saw all the ordinary people living their lives in this small, improbable island of civilization, in the middle of a vast, unforgiving desert. "I reckon," he said finally, his voice full of a wisdom earned through blood and sorrow, "a ghost shows up when folks need saving from something they can't handle alone. But a man sticks around after. He helps them learn how to save themselves." Danny nodded, accepting this as a fundamental truth. Then his serious expression dissolved into a wide, brilliant grin. "So you're really going to stay? Forever and ever?" A feeling, warm and light, spread through Ezra's chest like the first light of dawn, after the longest night of his life. For decades he had been a ghost, running from town to town, a stranger to everyone, including himself. The future had always been a heavy pack on his shoulders. But now, here, in this dusty little town, it felt like a gift waiting to be unwrapped. "Yeah, son," he said, raising his tin cup in a silent salute to the bright morning sky. "I think old Ezra Malone is finally ready to stop running. If you believe that even the most broken soul can find redemption, and that true heroes are often found in the most unexpected places, then do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the next story."